The rain fell in thin, uneven sheets against the glass windows of Ethan Cole's workshop, a rhythmic percussion that usually soothed his restless mind. But tonight, the sound only added to the storm inside him. His invention, the one he had poured nearly a decade of his life into, was no longer his. It had been stolen, stripped from him with the swipe of a pen and the false charm of a man he had once called a friend. Ethan was not the kind of man who trusted easily, but when Daniel Mercer walked into his life 3 years ago with promises of funding, legal support, and access to manufacturing connections, Ethan had let his guard down. He remembered that first meeting in vivid detail, the clean-cut suit, the practiced smile, and the way Daniel had spoken his name as if it were already tied to greatness. "You've got the brain," Daniel had said. "I've got the means. Together, we'll make history." Ethan, exhausted from years of rejection letters and dwindling savings, had let himself believe. The invention itself was nothing flashy, at least not to the untrained eye. It was a compact energy module, no larger than a paperback, capable of storing renewable energy at a fraction of the current market cost. To Ethan, it was the culmination of every late night, every failure, every scrap of genius he had managed to salvage from frustration. To Daniel, it was a gold mine. Contracts were signed, prototypes built, and for a time, Ethan felt the fragile thrill of his dream within reach. But then came the betrayal. The call had been brief. Daniel's voice, once warm, was clipped and professional. "We've restructured the company," he said. "The patents are now under my name. You'll receive a severance package, of course. I'm afraid your role here has ended." The line went dead before Ethan could even protest. Days later, his name was erased from every document, every credit, every trace of the invention that bore his sweat and blood. The weeks that followed were a haze of rage and despair. He tried to fight back, but lawyers were expensive, and Daniel's influence reached farther than Ethan had ever realized. Courts dismissed his claims, friends turned away, and soon he was left alone in his dim workshop, staring at the scattered notes and diagrams that felt more like gravestones than blueprints. But anger is a strange fuel. Where grief weakens, rage hardens. And as Ethan sat among the relics of his stolen dream, an idea began to take root, not of justice, but of revenge. He started quietly. He dug through every old email, every recorded conversation, every draft of contracts that Daniel had carelessly brushed past. He found discrepancies, half-truths, and signatures that told a different story than the one Daniel had painted to the courts. Then, he went further. He tracked Daniel's investors, his supply chains, his weak points. He learned to be patient, to gather each fragment of information as if building a new invention, one not made of wires and circuits, but of silence and shadows. Months passed before he made his move. Daniel's company had just announced a major deal with a government agency, the kind of contract that would secure its dominance for decades. Cameras flashed as Daniel stood at the podium, all charm and confidence, speaking of innovation and progress. Ethan watched the broadcast from a dingy cafe, his hands steady around his cup of black coffee. By then, everything was in place. The leak hit the news the next morning. Confidential documents, emails, and recordings appeared across multiple outlets, painting Daniel Mercer not as a visionary, but as a fraud. Evidence of patent theft, embezzlement, and falsified safety reports spread like wildfire. Investors panicked. The government contract was suspended within hours. By the end of the week, Daniel's face, once a symbol of innovation, had become a headline for scandal. Ethan didn't stop there. He had prepared something more personal. In the chaos of Daniel's downfall, Ethan released a public statement, brief, direct, and undeniable. He revealed himself as the true inventor, providing detailed schematics and dated research that no one could dispute. Former colleagues came forward, validating his claims. Universities that had once ignored him now reached out for lectures. The world began to recognize the name Daniel Mercer not as an innovator, but as a thief, and the name Ethan Cole as the mind behind the technology that could change the future. Daniel tried to fight back, of course. He called Ethan a liar, an opportunist, a bitter failure. But the evidence was overwhelming. Lawsuits mounted, his assets froze, and whispers of prison circled the edges of his empire. Ethan watched it all unfold with a strange calm, not triumph exactly, but something sharper. He had not just reclaimed his invention, he had dismantled the man who had stolen it. Years later, when people asked Ethan how it felt to see justice done, he rarely answered directly. He would only smile faintly and say, "Justice is slow, but revenge is meticulous." His invention went on to power homes, hospitals, and cities, fulfilling the promise he had always believed in. But in the quiet of his workshop, surrounded by the hum of machines and the scent of solder, Ethan knew the truth. His real invention had not been the energy module at all. It had been the plan, the careful, relentless design of retribution. And that, more than anything, was his masterpiece. The silence after Daniel's collapse was almost louder than the noise that had preceded it. For Ethan, the moment of victory didn't come with applause or celebration. It came in the form of a quiet evening, sitting alone in his workshop, when he realized for the first time in years he could breathe without the weight pressing on his chest. But revenge, once tasted, has a way of lingering. It changes a man. He had spent so long piecing together the downfall that he almost didn't know what to do with himself once the plan was complete. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept replaying every step, every decision, every risk he had taken. There had been nights when one mistake could have ruined everything. Nights when Daniel's lawyers sniffed too close, when Ethan had to vanish into shadows, living like a ghost while building the trap. And now that the trap had sprung, the adrenaline refused to fade. Daniel, meanwhile, was unraveling in full view of the world. The press that had once adored him now hounded him relentlessly. Former allies turned their backs, investors demanded answers, and investigators dug into every corner of his past. Ethan would sometimes sit with his laptop, reading the headlines with a detached fascination. He wasn't gloating, not exactly. It was more like watching a storm tear apart a house he had once been forced to live in, a house built on lies. But Daniel was not a man to go down quietly. Even as his empire crumbled, he fought. He accused Ethan of hacking, of sabotage, of planting evidence. He hired private investigators to dig into Ethan's past, trying to uncover anything that could smear his name. Ethan knew this would happen, and he was prepared. He had made sure his tracks were clean, his methods untraceable. Every breadcrumb Daniel followed only led him into darker corners of his own corruption. The harder Daniel struggled, the deeper he sank. Still, Ethan couldn't deny the strange connection between them. They had once stood side by side, united by ambition, however different their motives had been. Now they were bound in another way, as enemies locked in a dance where one's ruin was the other's redemption. Sometimes Ethan wondered if Daniel thought of him at night, the same way he thought of Daniel. Two men, two visions of power, forever entwined in the memory of betrayal. The turning point came when Daniel was finally indicted. Fraud, theft, conspiracy, the charges stacked high enough to crush any hope of return. Ethan watched the televised court appearances, noting how the once proud man's shoulders slumped a little more each day, his arrogance stripped away layer by layer. When the guilty verdict arrived, Ethan didn't cheer. He simply turned off the screen and returned to his blueprints. The fight was over. But here was the cruel truth. Revenge, though satisfying, does not heal. Ethan had his name back, his invention recognized, his legacy restored. Yet the years he had lost, the trust shattered, the sleepless nights spent in bitterness, those could never be returned. His victory was sharp and hollow, a blade that cut both ways. People hailed him as a genius, a visionary, a man of resilience, but inside, he carried scars invisible to the world. And yet, in some strange way, Ethan embraced those scars. They were proof of his journey, reminders of the cost of genius and the danger of trust. He had been naive once, open-hearted, desperate for someone to believe in him. That Ethan no longer existed. In his place stood someone sharper, colder, more deliberate. He was no longer just an inventor. He was a survivor, a strategist, a man who understood that the mind could be a weapon as powerful as any creation. Years later, when Ethan unveiled the second generation of his energy module, smaller, stronger, more efficient, he did so on his own terms, under his own name. The applause was thunderous, the recognition global. But when he looked out over the crowd, he didn't see admirers. He saw potential thieves, opportunists, rivals waiting for the smallest weakness. And he smiled because now he knew better. Daniel Mercer's name faded into history, a cautionary tale of greed and deceit. But Ethan Cole's name endured, not just for the invention that changed the world, but for the story whispered behind closed doors. The story of a man betrayed, who built his revenge with the same precision he once built his machines. A man who proved that sometimes the greatest creations are not found in metal or circuitry, but in the quiet, patient art of retribution. And though the world would never know the full extent of what he had done, Ethan carried the truth like a hidden blueprint etched into his bones. He had built his masterpiece, and it had destroyed the man who stole from him. That, in the end, was enough. The years that followed Daniel Mercer's downfall were a strange mixture of triumph and unease for Ethan Cole. He had regained his invention, his credibility, and even a measure of fame. Universities called him a pioneer, investors lined up at his door, and journalists wanted his story splashed across glossy magazines. Yet, behind every smile for the cameras, Ethan felt a quiet hollowness, like standing in a house rebuilt on scorched earth. Revenge had been his compass for so long that without it, he sometimes wondered if he still knew where he was headed. The work became his refuge. His workshop, once dim and suffocating, filled again with the hum of machines, the clutter of prototypes, the smell of solder and oil. He pushed his invention further, refining it into something even greater than what Daniel had stolen. There was solace in creation, but also a shadow. Every time he sketched a design, he saw Daniel's smirk hovering at the edges of his thoughts. Every time he tightened a bolt, he remembered the pen stroke that had erased his name from his own patent. It was as if Daniel had left a ghost behind, not a haunting presence of a man still alive, but the echo of betrayal, forever etched into Ethan's memory. He didn't hate the ghost. In some twisted way, he needed it. It kept him sharp. Meanwhile, the world watched Daniel unravel. Prison changed him. Reports filtered through the news. How he had tried to manipulate fellow inmates, how he lost privileges for starting fights, how the charm that once dazzled boardrooms had curdled into bitterness. Ethan never visited him, though sometimes he imagined what he would say if he stood face to face with the man who had tried to erase him. Would he spit venom, or offer silence? Would he thank him, even, for shaping him into someone stronger, someone capable of vengeance? Ethan never found the answer, but he carried the question like a splinter in his mind. Then came the day when he stood before a crowd at an international energy summit, presenting the newest version of his module, sleeker, more powerful, capable of powering entire neighborhoods off a single unit. The applause was thunderous, the admiration undeniable. As the cameras flashed, Ethan allowed himself a small smile. The boy who had been dismissed as a dreamer had become the man who reshaped industries. His name, once buried under lies, now stood engraved in the pages of history. But in the quiet moments, late at night, when the applause had faded and the workshop hummed with nothing but his machines, Ethan admitted to himself what no one else knew. His true legacy wasn't just the invention. It wasn't even the revolution in energy he had sparked. His true legacy was the revenge itself, the meticulous, relentless campaign that had stripped Daniel Mercer bare. The invention had given him purpose, but the revenge had given him power. And perhaps that was the real danger. He had learned how intoxicating it felt to dismantle an enemy piece by piece. He had learned that a brilliant mind could build destruction as elegantly as creation. The thought both thrilled and unsettled him. Because once a man learns to use his genius as a weapon, what is to stop him from using it again? Ethan never answered that question, even to himself. But sometimes, as he worked alone in his workshop, he would pause, listening to the rain against the windows, and smile that faint, knowing smile. He had defeated Daniel Mercer, reclaimed his place, and proven his worth to the world. Yet somewhere inside, he understood a deeper truth. The revenge he had crafted was not just justice served cold. It was the blueprint for a darker part of himself, a part that would never die as long as the world kept giving him reasons to remember the theft of his dream. Because the invention had changed the future. But the revenge? The revenge had changed Ethan Cole forever.